Hello and welcome to Season 4, Episode 9 of Unlimited Opinions. I'm Adam Bishop,
I'm Mark Bishop.
and this time, or we are, of course, always reading Alan Ryan's On Politics. In this chapter, we are covering, or this episode, we're covering his chapter on the 14th-Century Interregnum. So kind of what happens after Aquinas and sort of a whole bunch of relations with church and state, kind of centered in and around the 14th century. So kind of 1200s, 1300s, 1400s. I just saw you zoom out on the Zoom call that we're on here. I'm not sure what is going on. That was weird.
I have to move my computer back a little bit so I can put my book out in front of me
I
because we're
see.
doing it remotely and I'm in my secret lair in my house.
Yes, we are, of course, unfortunately, back and remote, but that is all right. We should hopefully still have some good conversations today. Do you have any opening thoughts, or should we get right into it?
Let's get right into it. Adam has an appointment that he has to get to, so I'm gonna try to limit my rants.
All right. So he starts
Right?
off.
I told you yesterday I didn't think I'd have any rants in
Yeah,
this
it
one.
wasn't really a rant worthy. It was good. It was a good chapter, but it wasn't really rant worthy.
Yeah,
He starts
yeah,
off
I
kind of
agreed.
introducing it, and he says that there are three thinkers that sort of dominate this era. We have Dante and his advocacy of universal monarchy, Marsilius of Padua and his claim that representative and constitutional arrangements should govern both state and church, and Bartolus of Sassoferrato's defense of semi-autonomous city republics of northern Italy. So three big thinkers here. But he says that none of the thinkers really had much of an immediate impact on politics. We see kind of their theories come to fruition much later. We saw, of course, these attempts to unify Italy under imperial rule had failed. The city-states were becoming increasingly dominated by aristocratic and autocratic rulers, and constitutional governed church measures were briefly successful, but after the Reformation, the church remained monarchical and hierarchical. So throughout this period, they really didn't take effect. But they were practiced much later. We see sort of Napoleon and Hitler in establishing a European empire. And the representative government of today is somewhat similar to what Marsilius said, and the relationship between states in the U.S. Would have fascinated Bartolus. And conciliarism, which is another big topic here, could be somewhat seen in representative democracy. And conciliarism is, of course, just the use of councils essentially in government is very, very basic definition, but that's sort of the general idea there. I guess you have no thoughts on that. You're looking like at the very bottom of the screen. It's like your head is tiny and
I'm
it is sitting at the
thinking.
bottom of the frame.
I know our viewer out there is going to be thrown off by my head being so low, but
Yes,
so
everybody
just
was.
squint. Tell the viewer just needs to squint and they can see me better. Yeah, that this whole chapter it's kind of striking how important the study of church hierarchy and church administration was then, and because you forget how intertwined the Catholic Church in particular was to the official government, from the last chapter and also this chapter in this period of time. And I think these guys make a lot of good points about how the Catholic Church can still be
Yeah.
reformed with more of a council type administration, and it is a reminder, that the Catholic Church always likes to say that it's kind of like uh, almost like the hand of God guiding the church through these difficult times, and it's a direct descendant of Saint Peter, basically the passing of the torch, so to speak. But it kind of goes sideways here when you have three popes at the same time, and they're all deposed, and a different guy is put in place, mainly by force. And you're reminded, yeah, you know what, these people that are running this shop are just human like me and you, and maybe it's a better system than having a whole bunch of old Italian dudes, because there's too many Italian cardinals deciding on the next pope.
Yeah.
They certainly failed in naming the current pope,
Hmm.
and this book was written obviously
Yeah, I was going to mention that.
before what's his name, uh, the
Benedict?
guy that resigned, huh?
Yeah. Benedict?
Benedict. Yeah, Benedict resigned because he references that there's a pope that resigned and nobody since then has resigned. Oh yeah, well, this guy did. And does anybody know why? I don't know why. Somebody knows why besides
Well,
Benedict.
let's
I
get
would I would suspect I'm getting on a rant.
you
I
are.
suspect there's probably about 50 witnesses to whatever it was that caused him to resign. And it wasn't because I just want to spend more time with my family. Anyway, go ahead.
Yes, let's get into this
How do you like?
discussion of church and state that he says here. He says that the conflicts between churches in the empire continued, especially regarding who had power over who, because one or the other could dominate central Italy and not both. So we're really seeing Italy as the foreground, or like really the battleground of this chapter, who has political power in Italy. And so the doctrine of the two swords was debated over whether the spiritual ruler could dictate to the secular ruler, but it never suggested that but nobody suggested that the popes could supplant the secular rulers in ordinary judicial and administrative rule, but also never denied that the spiritual sword was superior. So they're kind of, it's a balance between the two that we're seeing here. And at the end of the 13th century, it became clear that the papacy was important in secular politics outside of Italy, or impotent, sorry, not important. Became very, very clear that they had no power outside of Italy in the secular world. In the last years of the 13th century, King Philip IV of France kidnapped the papacy physically and organizationally, relocating the papacy to Avignon, during which the papal court was at the mercy of the French king until 1378. Then we also see that after King John of England had been excommunicated and forced to acknowledge the Pope as his feudal overlord in exchange for the lifting of the excommunication, the church was marginally more free to choose bishops, but the kings of England and France continued to tax clergy. So we're still seeing those issues that we talked about in the last couple episodes. The taxation, the choosing of bishops are very much important here. And I really like
Well,
that.
yeah, because they're essentially like mayors of a city,
Mhm.
or not even mayor, like a regional governor in a military dictatorship. I mean, they have absolute power within, just similar to what bishops have, not us bishops, but
Yes.
religious bishops have in the Catholic Church. You have complete authority, from the Pope, and when you're running the show, there's going to be this struggle, and it's a different subject as to whether that's a good thing for the church or for people's souls and all that kind of stuff. But it makes sense that there's this constant struggle between the governmental authorities saying, pay your taxes like everybody else
Mhm.
because you're running a city there.
Yeah, there's a good passage here where he talks about the wealth of the church. He says the Catholic Church was a formidable force, is wealthier than any single European state, owning perhaps a quarter of all the land and movables in Europe, and had a firmer grip on the loyalties of Christendom than most secular rulers. But these were wasting assets. Bishops who lived like princes gave the lie to the claim that the church held its wealth in trust for the poor, and popes who spent taxes raised in France and England on fighting emperors in Italy ran into a growing sense of national identity and national loyalty. So it's like, yeah, if you're taking the money from all these countries and then using it for your own purposes, why are we going to support you over our own country? It doesn't make any
Right.
sense.
Right. And it's corrupting.
Hmm.
The money and the power corrupts.
Yep. He mentions that Rome itself was in turmoil. We had the Gaetani and the Colonna families in Italy or in Rome were using the papacy as a get-rich-quick scheme for themselves and their relatives. We see very two prominent families there. And then the very big scandal was, of course, from 1292 to 1294. The papal throne was vacant because the cardinals could not agree on who to vote for. And this was resolved by electing the aged Peter Morone, a hermit who took the title Celestine V. But he could not handle the office and resigned after a few months and was placed under arrest and died in captivity 10 months later. So in 1294, Boniface VIII was elected to replace him, but this was a very contentious election. Celestine had no right to resign, and Dante even placed him in the lowest circle of hell and inferno for his cowardice, so Celestine was not very highly viewed. And Boniface faced many issues and fought over taxation, and so conceded that Philip VIII could indeed tax clergy in emergencies, but issued this papal bull, the Aesculto Filii, which came close to asserting that the Pope had temporal jurisdiction over the king. And so, of course, the king repudiated these claims and wanted to assert royal control over the church in France. And so he engaged in a large propaganda battle, and Boniface then wrote Unum Sanctum, which claimed outright that the authority of the popes to depose kings was real and could depend on ratione peccati, the reasons of sin. And so Philip declared Boniface heretical, and when Boniface left in 1303 for the Gaetani stronghold of Agnani, Philip's chief advisor led mercenaries and Colonna troops to Agnani, and very old and ill, the stress killed Boniface, leading to the election of the Frenchman Clement V, who established the court at Avignon. So very, very big struggle there. Just one pope after the other, all kind of terrible in their own right. It depends on how you look at it, which one's worse. But yeah, we had Celestine who resigned, which brought about Boniface, who asserted, complete dominance essentially, and then he fled and died of old age and sickness, and then we had Clement V, who established the court at Avignon.
And
So,
I wonder if what's the guy that quit and got arrested? Celestine.
mhm.
I wonder if he agreed to serve, like if he campaigned for that and
Yeah,
then didn't serve, or I'll have to read about that because it seems kind of unfair if he got recruited and he's like, I quit, and they're like, yeah, get in prison, and then he dies, you know. But I mean, it's interesting church history. But the author seems to be really fascinated with this struggle between the church and the emperors or the kings and that kind of stuff. And I'm reading this, I'm interested in it, but I'm like, okay, let's get to the theory. You know, okay, here's a setup. What do these philosophers have to say about political philosophy that is relevant, that makes all this relevant to the book?
yes,
And
and
that's
that's where
still
we get with Dante.
yes,
That bit on church history.
because generally the thinkers of the time were like, this church stuff sucks. Yeah, they don't know how to run. They're corrupt. They're stealing from us. They want to act like they're kings. They waste all these resources, and so we need to find a better way.
Yep.
And Dante puts the former pope in the seventh circle of hell or whatever it is in his
Yep,
book.
the lowest circle. So Dante was born in 1265 and was an ambitious young man and joined one of the guilds that supplied political candidates. And so in June 1300, he became one of the 6 priors that governed Florence. And in 1301, he went on a diplomatic mission to Rome, and while he was away, a coup brought the Black Guelphs to power, and so he was forced into exile on the pain of death at the stake if he returned. And so there were two
You
factions
know,
of
hey, I need to interrupt. I have a new name for your band,
the
the
Black
Black
Guelphs.
Elves. That's great.
I don't know about that one. So you have these two factions, the White Guelphs and the Black Guelphs. And the White Guelphs were Dante's allies and were hostile to Boniface, and the Black Guelphs were papal clients. And so Dante never forgave Boniface particularly for his exile. He kind of blamed him for the rise of the White and the Black Guelphs. So he publicly and savagely criticized the papacy, but he was not impressed by his allies, the White Guelphs, and they were not impressed by him either. And so he was never given honorable terms for return when peace was restored in Florence. And so he died in exile in Ravenna in 1321, and his body was never returned to his ungrateful mother city. So kind of a sad story for Dante, because he really, really loved Florence, and then it just so happened that a coup broke out while he was gone, and he was never able to return.
Yep.
And so Dante is, of course, best known for the Divine Comedy, but his political works his main political work was De Monarchia, on the monarchy, and in this he argues for universal monarchy on 3 bases: philosophy, the history of Rome, and scripture. And he mentioned that this is fairly utopian. Rome was his example, in that it largely left cities within the empire to attend to their own affairs. And so he thought that only a revived empire on this Roman model could provide the environment in which humanity could flourish. So he goes on and he doesn't condemn the papacy's spiritual authority, but he condemns its overreach in secular matters. He says the proper relationship was a morally upright monarch who looked to the Pope for spiritual advice and used his own power to secure the Church's earthly interests, not that the Pope has complete power over this secular monarch.
Right. And it surprises me that so many of these thinkers were so supportive of a monarchy, and
Mm-hmm.
they were all convinced that the power should be in one hand, but I guess one person's hands. But I guess they just experienced so much of the bloodshed associated with rival factions,
Mm-hmm.
because now people say, oh, it's so terrible, politics in the United States is so terrible. Well, aside from a one off here and there, like that guy's on trial now for running over a bunch of white people in Waukesha,
Waukesha.
I guess.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Of course, that was maybe more race related than political, but you don't see a whole lot of political violence like you would
Mm-hmm.
per capita back then between rivals, where they'd just be killing each other and stuff like that.
We're not seeing
That's,
factions of people take over cities and then, if say that if the politician who's gone comes back, he'll be killed at the stake. Like that's not really a thing that happens anymore.
um, not formally. I mean, well, and it's not gotten to that point, but Ted Cruz went to the Yankees Houston Astros game,
Hmm.
and people were flipping him off and cussing him out and all that kind of stuff. So we're getting closer. Give enough time, Adam. We'll get there. We'll get there. We'll get there. The violence against political opponents. But the other point I want to make is I don't think you mentioned it. was that his book was put on the Forbidden Books Index,
Yep.
which was created in 1559 and only removed from that list in 1891. And I had not read Dante,
Hmm.
but I had kind of heard of Dante, and I always knew or somehow had the impression that it was like an evil book or something,
Huh.
like from my youth. And I don't know why that is. I still have that kind of like, ooh, Dante, Dante's important. Uh,
Yes, but
so
then
maybe,
he goes
maybe
into
it's
a
a generational
description.
thing.
Maybe. But then he goes into his description of the three books of De Monarchia. And so the first book, he describes that the purpose of life in society is to allow the human species to attain a life of reason and govern himself by moral law. And this cannot happen in the absence of peace, and so peace, therefore, is the fundamental duty of rulers. And so then achievement of perfection cannot be the work of one person or group. The whole of mankind must be involved, and so therefore we owe our allegiance to a universal monarchy. So it has to be one, collective group under one
Mm-hmm.
person, essentially. That's
Kind
sort of
of a theory of collective wisdom.
mhm,
If you get enough people, and then that's kind of the theory behind elections. Representative democracy is it, or even jury trials.
mhm.
Is that a group of people far less likely to make a bad decision than one person if they deliberate on it, as opposed to just a mob. Get him,
Yeah.
get him.
And so that's his philosophical reason there in this first book. And in the second book, he moves into kind of the history of Rome in his argument. He says it was God's will that there should be the Roman Empire. He saw Rome as the manifestation of God's intention that humanity should develop all its capacities under a regime of peace and justice, and so therefore an empire is reasonably good. He says Rome had acquired its power lawfully by the right of combat. He doesn't agree with the idea that might makes right, but he does say that success under appropriate conditions is a sign of heaven's favor. So it's not just
Mm,
because Rome was stronger, it's because Rome succeeded, and that kind of proves that it had heaven's favor in that regard. And because it had that justice, it had that peace, and so therefore it was God's will that Rome should exist. And so we need an empire like that again. Then in the third book, he goes into scripture.
don't you think that's kind of a don't you think that's a kind of a dangerous theory?
Mhm.
That a successful group was successful because it was ordained by God, as opposed to, well, we murdered everybody else,
Yeah.
and
Well, I mean, it kind of
killed
goes
them,
back
and
to Aristotle, I think, a little bit, in his idea that, if we observe the natural world, then that's the thing that nature wants to achieve because that's how it happened. I think is kind of the underlying idea
yeah,
there.
right,
And
yep.
so then in the third book, he goes to Scripture, and he first attacks the idea that Scripture gave the authority to popes rather than the empire. And so he attacks the legality of the donation of Constantine, which was a document that was forged in the 8th century to look like a 4th century charter in which Constantine transferred power to the Western Roman Empire. And so he says that the emperor cannot divest himself of imperial authority. You cannot alienate political authority from the emperor or his successors. And so he attacked the two swords doctrine as an ungrounded intent of the New Testament. He also attacked the binding and loosing powers, stating that there was much a pope could not do on earth. He points to the example of, Saint Peter could not dissolve a validly contracted marriage, so therefore, how can popes depose emperors if they can't even do away with a marriage? How can they, take down this, very powerful person? He so says if Christ had the intention to deny the emperors the right of freestanding political authority over the world, he would have done so. Is his scriptural reasoning, which, I mean, fair enough, I guess.
Right, and I like this one uh, quote from the book is, nobody has the right to do things because of an office he holds which are in conflict with that office. So you can't give up the power permanently that you hold in that office just because you temporarily occupy the office.
Mm-hmm.
And I think there's a lot of truth to that. And I wish somebody would tell Joe Biden that you can't do things that are beyond your office power just because you hold the office temporarily.
Yeah, but it's an interesting argument. Of course, I'm not a fan of universal monarchy, but within sort of the scope of Dante, I think he provides decent enough reasoning for it. Like, I think his logic is, somewhat there if we accept that a universal monarchy is something to be desired. I think these are fairly decent, well-supported reasons for suggesting that, especially in this Christian world.
True.
True. No thoughts on that?
Mm.
All right, moving on
Well,
to the next.
we're on deadline, man. I don't want to argue with you.
Moving on to the next thinker, Marsilius of Padua. He was born in the late 1270s in Padua, and in 1313 he served as the rector of the University of Paris, and was later frequently employed by the Della Sales family of Verona and the Visconti family of Milan. And he began to write this work called the Defensor Pacis, or the Defender of Peace, around 1315, and he published it anonymously in 1324. But his authorship became known because it was a work that attacked the papacy. Paris became unsafe for him, and so he fled to the court of the Emperor Ludwig of Bavaria and remained close to the royal court and wrote the Defensor Minor around 1340 and died soon after, probably in 1342. So I like how Alan Ryan describes the Defender of Peace here. He says, "The Defender of the Peace is a long book, some 500 pages in most translations. It was so fiercely anti-papal that Pope John XII declared it heretical on 5 counts, but even before reading it. It provided for the first time a theory of secular authority carefully distinguished from the account of spiritual authority by which it was accompanied, and the view of authority in both spheres rested on the doctrine of government by consent. Almost as important, the account of government by consent was backed by a theory of representation." So kind of a very strict, separation of church and state here has to be based on the consent of the people. But I do like that it was condemned 5 times before it was even read by the Pope. And so he goes on to argue against the absolute authority of the Pope over the church and against its role in secular politics. And so he set out to base authority on the consent of the governed, and this applies to both kingdoms and the church. So it's not just, a political theory, but it's also sort of a religious political theory, if that makes sense. He used
Yeah,
the...
like they admit like the administration of the
Mhm.
church, as opposed to doctrine of what to believe. Is how
Yes.
does it run? Who says what? But also, I guess, who decides what the doctrine is too. And generally, after this, I guess you really see the rise of the Vatican councils and the council of this, council of that, trying to make those kind of decisions. Of course, our current pope just does things, one off just because he feels like it, like contradicting Catholic philosophy that is centuries old with regard to the death penalty, just because he doesn't like it.
True, very
But
true.
anyway, another note.
But he goes on to use Aristotelian theory of government to claim that authority is morally legitimate only when founded on the consent of the people. And so he appeals to what he thought of as a self-evident idea that men come together in a political community to live a self-sufficient life. That is the point of a political community. So therefore, the state is the highest form of association because it achieves self-sufficiency. There's nothing above the state. And so it says civil happiness is earthly self-sufficiency. In the biggest threat at the time to this civil happiness and a peace was the papacy. So if we have this papacy exist in the way that it does, we will not have this civil happiness. We will not have this self-sufficiency to ourselves.
What do you think about that theory that is the highest form of a governmental system that provides for civil happiness defined as earthly self-sufficiency?
I mean, I think I like that idea. I really do. I think, it kind of ties back into, I mean, if you read it the right way, it ties back into, limited government. The government is there to help you become self-sufficient. The government is not there for you to rely on it. It can
Mm-hmm.
help you get to a state where you are taking care of yourself, but it's not there to just, support you in every single thing that you do. And I think that's very true.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think, of course, in our today's world, it's very hard to be self-sufficient because we're so interconnected and
Hmm.
compartmentalized. But I think it speaks to me. I think it's a good idea, as self-sufficient as he can be,
I agree.
as opposed to the opposite, which seems like we're encouraging people just be dependent,
Yeah.
and just rely upon the government from birth till the grave.
Mm. So he goes on to defend this
Mm.
idea of temperate rule. He says that a ruler must act according to the law, but he did not hold the modern idea that there are areas of life about which the law should be silent. He did believe that the law applied to, everything judicial, military, religious, so really every aspect of life the law has some sort of say. But he said that representative institutions and elections ensure that the wisest rule. This is not necessarily limited government, but that, the wise do have all of the power, but the wise will inherently be temperate, and the purpose of institutions is to secure wise rulers. That's why we should have elections. That's why we should have representatives.
What do you think of that?
I mean, I think it's a part of the idea of why we have elections today. Like, I know the biggest reason why we have elections is really to, to have a check on the people in power, and that's not his reasoning. But I do think it's part of it. I think at least most people go to the polls with the idea that, this person, you know, will probably represent people better than the majority of people, if that makes sense. But I mean, we did have that conversation a few episodes ago of, at this point, it might be better if whoever represented us was just randomly picked from the total population of the
Hmm.
United States. So I don't know if it's that true anymore, but I think that is part of the idea of why we have elections.
Yeah, I guess. I've become so negative on it.
Mm,
And I think so many people I know are, and across society, it's like we're just picking from the lesser of literally, the lesser of two evils.
yeah.
We don't like any of the candidates, and so we don't have a system. Currently, I don't think anybody thinks that the United States system currently
Mhm.
is set up to pick the wisest,
Yeah.
and
No.
and I don't know that you can have that. I don't
Mhm.
know how to do that system unless you somehow limit the candidates,
Yeah.
through some sort of standards, and I think that's even worse.
Hmm.
And I think I'm operating under the assumption that the people who are willing to serve are probably the maybe it would disqualify them.
Yeah, I think it's almost like an idea of who is most capable of serving, if that makes sense, because I think
Right.
money is the biggest factor there, and it's whoever can, has the free time and has the amount of money to just sit around in office, and that sort of thing is, to fund the campaigns and things like that. I think it's more of capability rather than, actual,
Mm,
are they the best choice?
true. All right. Thanks.
So then he goes on to talk about how continuous consent is essential to legality. The consent of everyone, other than the vicious and undiscerning, and those who are so poor that they have no stake in society at all. So those are who should have the power to vote. It's not every single person in a society. It's just kind of these. It's not like a few people. It's still, although it could be. He goes on to say that, in some circumstances, such as the election of the emperor, it can be just like a council of six people. But in some, it should be representative of those who are sort of the best in the society. He says that many heads are better than one, and so a wise ruler needs counsel, and the best government involves many persons. He says the support for persons and policies is based on the choice of the more powerful part of the people. Enough people may be a small number, and like I said, for example, the imperial electors. And what occupied more space in the Defensor Pacis rather than his actual political theories was his assault on the political power of the papacy. He argued that Christ gave the power to bind and loose to all the apostles equally, and therefore authority in the church should be shared. And so this is this argument for the conciliar form of church government. He says that the church was also not entitled to its vast wealth, as the apostles relied on their followers to provide shelter and support. He says therefore the church had no legitimate coercive authority, and therefore could not legislate, only excommunicate, and the power to excommunicate belongs to the church as a whole rather than just the pope alone. So he argued that Christ gave the disciples the power to teach and advise and not rule, and that's sort of his biggest, most strong argument there, or his most inflammatory, I suppose. And Alan Ryan kind of notes that this is very close to John Locke's view of voluntary association is what a church really
Mm,
is. And there's
right.
some truth to that, but yeah, you could see why this was condemned so much by the Pope. This guy is saying, Christ gave you no power to do any of the things that you are doing. You have done it completely wrong. And yeah,
Right.
that would make me pretty angry if I was the Pope, I think.
Yeah, I think it also, I found that when people tell me I'm wrong and I'm right, it doesn't bother me. But when
Mm-hmm.
people tell me I'm wrong and I'm wrong, it's like, ooh, that hurt. And I
Yeah.
think that would be it because I really think the guy's spot on.
Hmm.
Don't you?
Yeah.
I mean,
Oh,
on the on
absolutely.
the
I
on the
can't
on the
argue with any
general
of those
nature
points.
of it, yeah, the authority that such as it is that Jesus conferred is really conferred on all of us,
Hmm.
and an obligation on all of us that, I think it transcends just the papal authority. I think it also speaks to, the civil authorities too. You don't have a right to tell me what to do unless we agree to terms that provides you with the privilege to tell me what to do. If that
Yeah,
makes sense.
that does make
And
sense.
I think the same theory applies to both administration and civil and spiritual.
Hmm. Moving on to Bartolus in the Italian city-states. This was interesting. I really liked this discussion because I knew nothing about the Italian city-states. But he says that the states and cities of northern and central Italy were notionally dependencies of the empire or the church, but from the 12th century on, most were not under the emperor's effective control. So each cared about their own freedom and cooperated only when threatened by imperial authority, and otherwise acted with a mixture of rivalry and disgust, similar to the Greek city-states. This is kind of, he
Yeah.
says, the closest thing that we had since ancient Greece to those Greek city-states. It says that they were aided by certain popes only to ensure the safety of papal states from German imperial powers. So every once in a while, the pope would step in and help them to, keep existing kind of as a barrier to the emperor.
Right.
They claimed to be defending the libertas of the Roman Republic. They were autonomous in that they were entitled to make laws for themselves, and at the time it was held that they only had this ability by the permission of the emperor. So it was kind of a freedom granted by the emperor, but they argue against this. And they reinvented many features of the early Roman Republic, in particular the appointment of magistrates to very short periods of office as a defense against tyranny. There was a notable absence of feudal lords in these Italian city-states, which a lot of commentators at the time thought was strange. And this led to a rapid turnover. This rapid turnover led to a lack of consistent policy and extreme factionalism in zero-sum politics. And so the solution, therefore, was a council whose assent the magistrate needed. And so the common pattern of double councils developed, one with many members that met in public and had few powers beyond a veto, and one with fewer members that met in secret and actually made policy. So that was kind of the structure of most of these states. But their eventual fate was to be governed by a hereditary dukes or counts who were frequently kept in power by outside forces such as the papacy, the empire, or at times the French and Spanish monarchy. And so this kind of brought about this question of the intersection of law and Italian city-states, and so this needed Italians who were trained in both canon and civil law, and that is where we get Bartolus of Sassoferrato. So kind of this question of, if you have your own existing law, but there's a law above you, where do they intersect? How do we resolve those differences there is sort of the question here. So
What
Bartolus,
what has the supremacy, like the
yes,
supremacy clause that all these people think that entitles the federal government to just run roughshod over all of our states here, but which doesn't mean what they think it means.
yes. So Bartolus was born in 1313 and died in 1357, and he studied law at Perugia and Bologna, and taught at Pisa and at Perugia, where he died at 43. He wrote lengthy commentaries on most aspects of Roman law, and he is thought of as the founder of the study of the conflict of laws. And so he had a very neat view on the legal status of semi-autonomous states. He says a true sovereign unites both de facto power and de jure authority that entitled him to wield it. So kind of this idea that if the ruler wants to assert his authority that is given to him, but he's trying to assert it over people who had not noticed this authority for a long period of time, then that authority kind of doesn't apply at all. It kind of reminds me of, we've talked about this before, but sort of the property law in Missouri. Like if you have a piece of property that somebody else has been using for, 10 years and you don't do anything about it and then try to get it back, then it's not yours anymore. And I think that's a similar argument that he's making here. If you have this authority that you claim, but you're trying to use it over a group of people who have not, even noticed that you've had this authority for such a long period of time, then you have no authority at all. You need to kind
Yeah,
of combine those two.
it's kind of a waiver.
Hmm.
If you have to assert it and get their consent or get their involvement or take some action, put everybody on notice. Hey, I'm still in charge, because otherwise you show up and they're like, who the hell are you?
Yeah,
Why you tell me
exactly.
what to do?
This,
Yeah, the concept you're talking about, we mentioned before, is adverse possession. So it's not unique to Missouri. It's an old law that will allow for the productive use of land, so you can't just sit on and ignore it.
mhm.
With large landholders, it's an important law, and it actually resolves a lot of disputes. I've got a couple of cases going on right now about it. One here in Festus, they have a border dispute, and it always starts. Can I tell you? I'll be quick. It
Yeah.
always starts the same way. Two neighbors who get along very well live side by side for
Mhm.
decades. One neighbor either sells or dies, and somebody new comes in and does a survey,
Mhm.
and then all hell breaks loose because they oh, your road is now, because I don't know if you know this, but gravel roads migrate over time with the weather and everything. They'll move. So and so this survey says your driveway is on my property, so you're gonna have to move it. Well, it's been there for 40 years, dude. You can't just put a fence over their road, But this one's actually in a subdivision, and
Hmm.
which is unusual. But same thing, and the new young couple moves in, and they start moving all their stuff, and their survey says that an outbuilding, like a big old I don't know, 3-car garage maybe, is like 10 feet over the property line.
Hmm.
Well, it's been there for quite some time, so they're going to lose out.
Yeah.
But anywho, so but it comes up all the time in property disputes. So it's not just some theory. It's
Interesting.
interesting to talk about.
It is. He then goes on to talk about this short essay that Bartolus wrote on the government of cities, and he explains how a city can be an autonomous lawmaking entity. He says a city exists when a people give themselves laws, essentially, and that's sort of the foundation of a city. And so he reads Aristotle as saying that monarchical government is absolutely best where it can be instituted, sort of this idea, of course, the divisions of government and that sort of thing, which ones are good and which ones are bad. Again, sort of the Aristotelian idea that, monarchy, if it's a good monarchy, would be the best. He says,
And I like how it's described. It's when a people
mhm,
gives itself law. So it's a people, like a community,
mhm,
sets up laws for itself. That's really where you get
yep.
a community or a city or a state or whatever.
Mhm. So he revived this concept of politeia as well. He had this common sense enthusiasm for popular governments where they can be instituted, but kingship by election is closest to what is divinely approved. He says a single ruler needs wise advice, sage counselors, and an independent council to keep him wise and honest. So again, sort of dividing, the good systems of government, but again, sort of relying on, it's an election of sorts. It has to be, but dependent on the people in a way. They choose the laws and stuff, and that is when a city is formed. But he was very hostile towards contemporary Rome. There was no unity, and there was this chaos of competing tyrants with an ineffectual notional ruler or city prefect. And so he ascribes this to the misdeeds of the Pope, chiefly just in his complete absence from Rome. But he displayed no animosity towards the papacy itself. In a way, he just kind of wants the papacy back in Rome, so there is some sort of structure there. And he said that, and he argued that tyranny can be accepted as a transitional government, but a long-lasting tyrant is terrible. And he says here, I'm going to read from the book. And the insidiousness of tyranny is such that it might even be invisible. Someone occupying no official position could exercise lawless power and be a tyrant. Bartolus thought that the factionalism of Italian city politics, he wrote a tract on the Guelphs and the Ghibellines, meant that faction leaders might have had such a hold over the officials notionally in charge that they were the true powers in the city, and if unjust, then tyrants. The modern mafia springs to mind. And I think that idea is still very much applicable to today. Who's actually, pulling the strings behind, a lot of politicians and stuff like that. And most of the time it's just, whoever their biggest donor is. But, I think that's, a tyrannical rule in a way.
I'm becoming more and more convinced of the conspiracy theories surrounding the World Economic Forum.
Are you really?
Oh, there's some truth to it.
Hmm.
There's some guy just got named Prime Minister of England, and he's in that crew, and it's wild to watch, and they aren't really private about it.
Hmm.
They're acting like they have the power,
Interesting.
and it'll work for a little while.
So we then move on to the last section, conciliarism in Occam. And so we had this conciliar movement, which was the product of the appalling state of the church at the end of its Babylonian exile in Avignon. Its capacity to influence European politics was undermined by being under the control of France and was seen as increasingly authoritarian, centralized, and corrupt. So the papacy returned to Rome in 1377 and 78, with the chaotic city aggressive to non-Italian cardinals. So many of these cardinals wished to return to Avignon, but the newly elected Pope Urban VI refused, provoking a revolt by the French cardinals who declared Urban's election invalid and elected Clement VII as anti-pope. So a council of the whole church was called to restore peace and unity, but it took nearly 70 years to achieve a settlement. The question of who could call a council was really the big thing, because neither the Roman nor the French Pope wanted to call a council that could depose him. So Marsilius's theories were appealed to, as well as those of William of Ockham. So William of Ockham was English. He was born in the 1280s and became a Franciscan friar and taught in Oxford, but took refuge in the court of Ludwig of Bavaria, and like Marsilius, wrote anti-papal tracts and took a skeptical view of the church, arguing that it was simply a collection of believers, and popes do not represent the mystical unity of the church, and representation must come from a delegation from individuals whom we collectively call the church. So an argument essentially that we need some sort of council to represent the church as a whole. It can't just be the pope saying everything himself. And so there were very mixed results about this. I like how he put it here. Pressure to call a council to resolve the schism had very mixed results. The first council, held in Pisa in 1409, failed to persuade either of the rival popes to resign. It added to the confusion by electing a second anti-pope, Alexander V, who died soon afterward and was succeeded by John XIII. A few years later, the Council of Constance, from 1414 to 1418, succeeded in deposing all three popes and electing Martin V, eventually accepted as the one legitimate pope. I just really like that the solution at first made a bigger problem, and that they had not two popes, but three popes at the exact same time. And so that the success of the Council of Constance was a tribute to Jean Gerson, who recommended giving authority in emergency to a council of the whole, and that the council's efficacy was due to the support of the Emperor Sigismund, who wanted to see unity, particularly to quell rebellions in his native Bohemia. So it was really outside influences that caused this, council to even be effective at all. They really had to have pressure from the outside, all these different thinkers, saying, hey, we need to get this figured out. This is terrible. It's been 70 years. We need to do something. And so the council declared itself the supreme governing body of the church and insisted on meeting frequently after that, but they did not at all. There was one other Council of Basel later that ended in the council splitting itself in two, but it did provoke an important tract from Nicholas of Cusa, who attempted to reconcile the consent of all Christians and the Pope's position as the head of the church. And so he devised this voting system for the Holy Roman Emperor that was rediscovered 300 years later and was known as the Borda count method of ranking preferences. And so after the Council of Basel, the church returned to its autocratic and hierarchical state. So lovely times with the church. Councils worked kind of. They accomplished the goal eventually.
Ultimately.
Yes.
And the only thing I could think of that entire time, reading it and then hearing you summarize it, was how dangerous it really was to have a pope and an anti-pope at the same time. If they came into physical contact, the whole universe would be destroyed. Little Star Trek humor there. And the other thought I had was, that's another great name for a band, Bishop and the Anti-Popes.
That is pretty
Which
good.
you would think anti-pope would be like evil, but it really just means not that pope.
Not that pope, yes.
Opposition to that pope, but or you could just be the anti-popes. But I like Bishop and the anti-popes.
Well, it's kind of an interesting thing because couldn't you have that same argument today with Benedict? Like, he still has that lifetime appointment. Couldn't technically, if enough cardinals or bishops were in support of it, establish their own papal court wherever, Benedict is, and, defy Pope Francis? Like, I guess, following, church law, maybe.
Well, I haven't done any I haven't done any research on the canon law on deposing a pope.
Yeah.
I don't know what the procedure is. I know it's corrupt. I don't know that. And it's a terrible system. And eventually it'll collapse under its own weight of corruption and malfeasance. And with the side order of bribes and sexual misconduct. So there'll be some of that mixed in.
That's lovely. Thank you for that.
Well, there's nothing good about the Vatican.
Yeah.
There's nothing good about the administration of the Vatican. I mean, nothing good about the administration of the Vatican. I said it 3 times because that's how clear it is. And they're all corrupt. They're all stealing from us, and they're all doing all sorts of weird stuff that they're not supposed to be doing. Every last one of them.
That is an aggressive.
So that's a happy thought at the end of. Well, and it's just dispiriting, because what are they really doing? What good are they doing in the world? Well, I don't know. But
sure.
We're going through a thing where you have to get you an update when you come back about the crazy plans they have for the archdiocese. They're going to be shutting down churches and major changes locally and throughout the side of the state. It's well, their focus is on evangelization to what do they call it? What's that buzzword they say about disenfranchised or marginalized people? So they want to reach out to marginalized people. And what they need to focus on now is trying to keep people in the church and try to bring the people back in that were in it that left. You got to have a foundation to, that we got no foundation because they're just stupid. But anyway, on back to the subject. It did ultimately show the wisdom of having a council decide these types of
Mhm.
things. You know, some sort of representative authority. So it's not madness. It's not pure democracy. It's some people that are qualified, however you decide that, to make a decision on who the pope is, and then ultimately, on certain church teachings or whatever the case may be. It's a good concept for administration and for resolving big issues in a disparate community.
Yeah,
You get
absolutely.
your representatives together where it's not a mob, and you take your time, and eventually, it should work out. Like this eventually worked out, and they got rid of all three of these knuckleheads, and they got a new one in.
Very
But
true.
I'm the divine inspired pope. I am the descendant of Saint Peter.
Yes.
And the other one says, "No, I am." The third one, "No, me." And the whole crowd says, "Get away! Off with you, all three of you. We're
Yes.
going to choose this guy in the corner."
Well, yeah,
Me? Better not quit. We're going to imprison you and then kill you.
lovely. Lovely. I think we need to start winding things down, though. I like this
Yes,
chapter. Set up some good theories that I think we'll look back on in the future, but some interesting stuff there with the church. Well, I've been Adam Bishop,
I'm still Mark Bishop.
and this has been Season 4, Episode 9 of Unlimited Opinions.
Excellent.
All right.
I try to keep my rant. I actually, now that I thought about it, I had probably about five more rants in the bag there
Yeah,
because it
no,
was
you definitely
Catholic
had some
Church.
rants. You definitely had
So,
some rants.
so I try to keep them short.